The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 13. Beyond Action and Reaction. Chapter 5. Different Magics. In the mind and body war, the war of sensation against intellect, the war of the high and the lowbrow, the war of women and men, you are expected to be obediently, conventionally, militant. If you agree, and if in the first, for instance, your occupation thrusts you into the ranks of the mind, then you have imposed on you an attitude of artificial hostility to the body. This may be against your nature, which disposes you to be friendly to both. The same through the whole list. The intolerance, the militancy order, the savage partisanship imposed on you on every possible subject, is a conscription that, intellectually, you must learn to evade. Qui terre est, guerre est is a French proverb. But without terror it is apparently the same thing. Everything is done to make people wish to be animals rather than men. A writer in the New Leader recently quoted what purported to be a letter from a perplexed correspondent. It expresses very well the widespread discouragement of the moderately ambitious man. "What is the use of being told about books," he wrote, "when I can't read them? I haven't the money to buy them, and 9 times out of 10 my local library hasn't got them, or if it has, there is a list as long as your arm of people waiting for them." Beginning on this personal note, his argument proceeded to wider considerations, raising the whole question of the value of civilization for the poor. A progress in culture, he said, meant a reduction in happiness. The more complicated a man's needs became, the more refined his tastes, the greater their liability to be outraged. The man who is used to good books is revolted by the Sunday papers that satisfy his fellows. The man who likes good music is a martyr to noise and shudders every time a barrel organ comes down his street. The man who recognizes a lovely building when he sees it, turns in loathing from the squalid ugliness of our towns. If he be rich he can to some extent obtain compensation for the pain his cultivated tastes cause him, by spending time and money on their satisfaction. He can only shudder away from a world of savages and hooligans and shrink into himself in pride and disgust. Thus, my correspondent ended, if I had to choose today between being a pig happy or being Socrates unhappy, and wisdom seems to point to the necessity of being one or the other, I should plump for the pigsty every time. To be happy is the object of the person illustrated in the letter. If you want to be happy you must not be a man, but a pig. And that is especially true today is indisputable. Well, the Circe of capitalism is able to achieve this for our shipwrecked world. We can either decide among ourselves, or draw lots, as to who shall be happy and who unhappy. There is a story that in the early days of socialism a certain labor leader had organized a demonstration in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of strikers assembled, and large forces of police were reported as approaching from all directions. The organizer of the demonstration passed round the word that all the manifestants, at the first sign of the police, should sit down. In due course the police appeared. They rushed furiously into Trafalgar Square from Whitehall, Cockspur Street, and the Strand. But a non-resisting human carpet was spread out at their feet. The entire crowd, as ordered, was sitting down on the ground. Some of the revolutionary movements in full swing today are an unconscious adoption of this method of meeting the difficulties of the time. It was a particularly good way, and one that people cannot be blamed for adopting. The only magic that the ruled have at their command in face of the demands of the ruler is such as balk the police in the above story. Complete industrial obedience would, no doubt, absolve you from constant doses of war and revolution. The corrective of civil disobedience since the world began has been military discipline, war, and bloodletting. Fourier refers to the magical effect of the capitalist transformation on his day in words already quoted. One is ready to believe in magic on seeing kings and empires thus circumvented by a few commercial sophisms, and the race of monopolists, stockjobbers, agitateurs exalted to the skies who employ their influence in concentrating masses of capital, in producing fluctuations in the price of products, ruining alternately all branches of industry. We have got used to the money magicians. We are all under their spell. The good European, perhaps Nietzsche's good European was after all a mockery, the brave European, brave as in German, is not very good at magic. He is very good at war, however. Of this he is very proud indeed. Any time you ask him to fight and show how good he is at war, there is no holding him. What a pity he is not a better magician, and, on the other hand, a less remarkable fighter. Oh, that fighting face of the novelette. Celui qui sera mon curé, je serai son paroissien, whoever will look after me can call me his client, is a good proverb for a good man, or good European. Whoever will be my Circe, I will be his swine would be the proverb for the writer of the letter quoted above. That argument turns on the question of the desirability of happiness, which each man instinctively resolves for himself. Happiness is the chief material also in the construction of utopias. Christ's is the most famous and the nearest to socialism. And the utopia of Christ can conveniently be compared with the utopia of the Ford industrial colonies or the ideal working-class community of Port Sunlight. Christ's millennium was the old Jewish dream of a land of promise. The hard cash of suffering and enslavement that the Jew was willing to pay down, in vicarious atonement, through his long genealogical sequences, passed on to the somberness of the Puritan. The dogged old Jewish optimism vanished, and the European must have a very imperfect notion of the dream of Jesus. However much, therefore, Christianity may have insisted on renouncing the world, the flesh, and the devil, it always kept in the background the perfectly Jewish and pre-rational craving for a delectable promised land. The journey might be long and through a desert, but milk and honey were to flow in the oasis beyond. Beyond the Puritan's savage gloom there was no Valhalla, however, much less the delectable oasis indicated above by Santayana, the honeypot of the Hebrew faith. However, whatever Christ's kingdom of heaven may have meant to his followers, there are certain elements in it that are accessible and generally understood. The difference between it and Port Sunlight, say, is this. Lord Leverhulme promised what he could perform, whereas Christ was in a very different position. The former was more honest, and, if allowed to, would, I think, in the fullness of time, have been a greater benefactor, measured by material cleanliness and comfort, than Christ. Port Sunlight is, in more senses than one, as I have suggested, a certainty. There is no last shall be first about it, it is a dead level of sanitary life, sunlit, but not pretending to be heaven. It would be impossible for a man to say that he had Port Sunlight inside him, as he can say that he has heaven within him. On the other hand, is Christ, promising what most likely can never come about, for that reason less of a benefactor than Lord Leverhulme or Henry Ford, promising what certainly can and will, most likely, come about? Christ's perfection was full of impossibilities, on the mundane plane, and to stage them he had to take his audience out of life altogether. His doctrine was a drug, beneath its influence men saw their wrongs being righted, saw the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, punished, and humble faith rewarded, the last first and the first last. Is it the action of an honorable man to give people these flattering visions? Is not the modern benefactor of big business, possibly sometimes of the type against which Christ inveighed, really the eternal rich man justifying himself, stealing a march on the magician and so-called savior? Even if this whitewashing of the whited sepulchre only resulted in a sanitary tiling such as we associate with lavatories and hospitals, is not perhaps this stone that the builder rejected, namely, the rich man, becoming the headstone of the corner? But does he not also get much more out of it than Christ? It might be objected. Even there it is not certain that Ford or Lord Leverhulme could not make good their claim for a bigger halo than Christ's. I have no means of knowing what exactly the author of Port Sunlight got out of life, or what Henry Ford is still enjoying, but I should think that probably, on the model of most millionaires, they both must have led a harassed, frugal, lonely existence, full of distrust and indigestion. The experience of Christ, like a lyrical poet dying young, under romantic conditions, worshipped by throngs of people attracted by his personal magnetism, living to some extent the rosy dream that he recited daily, this experience sounds on the face of it more enviable than that of a modern millionaire. Malheur celui qui en rit, il n'y comprend pas l'esprit humain, se fier et originalite, petit esprit qui n'appreciait pas ce qui dépasse la vulgarité dans salon, les étroits limites d'un bon sens vulgaire. So Renan writes of those who are apt to laugh at the holy passion of Saint Therese, or other saints and madmen. Malheur indeed, and we must not be too hasty in taking Port Sunlight into our hearts in the place of the full Christian or other dream. But is not Christ's too exceptional a fantasy for the average of human desires? The more discriminating arrangements of the Hindu heaven, or system of heavens respond probably more accurately to the reality of human wishes.